Okay, I'll shortly introduce Elisabeth. Elisabeth Leerssen is a Dutch textile designer. Is the sound okay? Textile designer, developer, and researcher. She studied textile and product design at the Gerrit Rietveld Academy in Amsterdam. And she's foundering of BAL Studio, where her focus lies in high performance textiles and sustainability.
All right. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm going to be sitting down to be a bit more comfy. Um, all right. Um, so I was really happy to find out the theme of this Spinnerei that deals with acoustics, which was part of my initial project proposition for the TaDA Residency application. So within this program, so we've been doing this for 2 months, 2.5 months. I explored the world of acoustic perception and the interaction between textiles and architecture. So sound and material, they interact, and I think they really collaborate and share an intimate connection. And I'm also interested how architecture can be experienced through sound, and how specific architectural volumes they can deform and transform sound. Uh, I think we need to start it again. Can you help me? Because it's empty again.
Oh,
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. So in my experience, the auditive awareness of our surroundings is sometimes a bit underestimated. It's often seen as a last addition to architectural projects, even in the homes or other spaces. It's not something that comes in mind the first thing, but it's so important to how we experience a space. And it really affects our daily experience. There's a lot of studies like how noise interrupts communication, it reduces productivity, and it can lead to fatigue and even negative effects on our health. Besides that, I'm also really interested how form and acoustics they interact. So I started a visual research and see how sound actually can impose form within architecture. So this is 2 examples from architect Alva Aalto. It's a library and a concert hall. And you can really feel how he thought about form and acoustics and how they're married together. I will go through it a bit quickly. This is an example of the Philips Pavilion for the World Expo in '58 by Corbusier and Xenakis, where sound, architecture, art performance, they all interlinked and they created this crazy structure. Or the opposite, when installation of Boys in the Centre Pompidou in Paris, where actually it's a muffled interior, utterly silent through the entire installation of felt wool. So within this project, I wanted to narrow down my focus on curtain textiles for architecture. As a designer, it's often requested from my clients. They want acoustic performance in the textiles they prescribe in architecture projects. But these are often quite typical fabrics. They're heavy velvets for theaters, or more if we want some transparency, it's sheared curtains with very synthetic and textured yarns, but there's not so much in between. So I wanted to deal with an experimental approach and to see if we could create another type of acoustic fabric which differentiates itself from these archetypical products that are already on the market, with maybe another type of a technique, another type of construction, or another type of raw material. So as a textile designer, I know nothing about acoustics. It's not my specialty. So I wanted to dive a bit deeper into that and reading through papers, sort of exploring the different aspects. So I really got stuck on how you can, with the material, you can reflect sound or absorb sound. And I decided that I really want to work with the sound absorption linked in this project. And I think it was a good sort of strategy to find a focus. And I was lucky to be accompanied by EMPA, where I spoke with one of their researchers, Reto Pieren, who has done a lot of research on actually how textile curtains absorb sound and all the different factors that affect it. So it can be the material in itself, its density, its weight, but also how it's hung in space. So if it's close to a wall or not, is it flat or folded or pleated? So he has come up with a series of theoretical models to actually predict how a certain fabric can react in a space, which in product development is really precious. So you don't have to create big installations and test it in a big Schallraum, but on a smaller level, you can really test your ideas. So after this research, I came up with 2 design hypotheses. Really wanting to work with the wool compositions to keep up the sustainability aspect, but also because it's something I'm curious about, how we could step away from Trevira and polyester fire retardant fabrics. So I was wondering how you can transform the surface of the textile itself to improve the acoustic absorption. So one of the questions was like, can we weave wool curtain fabrics that have an inherent undulating texture to have a bigger surface for sound absorption? Or can we also invite transparency into wool textiles and see how they interact with sound? So I set up a series of development specifications. I will go through it really quick because it might be a bit boring, but it sort of shows the product development framework I put for myself. There we go. So the first developments we started with the help of TISCA. So where we focus on the weaving technique, and I was able to work with them on the jacquard loom. And when working in weaving developments, the warp setup is so specific, especially when we don't want to do small samples. So we work with an available warp, and I was lucky they had one on the loom in 58% wool and a bit of polyamide. However, it's a warp with a very dense setting for upholstery. So I had to sort of work my way around that for it to work for a curtain fabric. And I think the best comparison is that imagine you want to cook a recipe. Instead of going to the store to buy your ingredients, you open the fridge and you see what you have and you try to be creative with that. So in this setup, I imagined 6, 7 different design options with different constructions and proportions. This is not so much a very much final design vision. It's really a way of experimenting how the material reacts to different textures, weave bindings. And I think it's really great for the TaDA program to allow this, because in normal industry, we would not have this much time to experiment with this. So you can see the samples at the head of the table. So I think it's interesting to see the ones that are blue are coming just from the loom. And when they're finished, so they're being washed and steamed, they actually create their texture. So they get pleats, they get a bit undulated. And the first approach was to have a bit of a hollow spacing. You can see it on the left image. So we have an undulating texture, but also a hollow spacing in between the fabric to create as much layers as possible for sound absorption. And a second approach was creating pleated layers, again, for creating maximum barriers. But also it's fabrics that behave and act in a really interesting way. Now they're flat on the table, but as soon as they're hung and pleated, they have a whole different sort of elasticity, which I think is interesting. The next steps for this is to continue the dialogue with TISCA. Actually, next week we're still weaving some new improvements. So these things take time to figure that out. Next to this woven research, I've been lucky to be accompanied by the Textile Museum in St. Gallen, and they welcomed us into their archives to, for me specifically, to explore the history of lace textiles. So they have a large collection of designs for lace curtains, and specifically also a lot of really beautiful archive pieces, which for an afternoon we were able to, with the help of Luba, to have a look into. These are mostly from the end of the 19th, beginning of 20th century. And first I was a bit set off by all these very decorative floral aspects, but really soon I found an angle that's really intrigued me. And it's actually this sort of small filling motifs that we see in between the floral elements. So it's this sort of mesh texture that's very delicate, but actually is holding together the whole fabric. Without them, it would be a loose element of flowers. And I found it interesting that they're both structural and decorative. And they sort of tell an interesting story where tradition meets innovation. So I made a little booklet. You can pass them around, so it's a bit more easy to see the details. And actually, I realized you can recognize some recurrent background patterns of this really simple but elaborate geometry. And it's a really subtle interaction between the design aesthetics and the machine limitations at the same time. And you can sort of trace back this Sangalan history of starting with handwork and needle lace, and then going from designs that are created for an industrial production. So I interpreted some of these textures in a more contemporary geometrical motif, playing around with scale and adapting them for a technique I wanted to use, which is the embroidery, again with the wool yarn. So this shows a bit the example of how we program these embroidery textures, because they're based on a fabric that we wash out, so only remain the wool yarn, and every stitch needs to be interlinked. So that was quite an interesting technical journey for me and a completely new approach. This we did with company Lasser, where I was able to test different designs, different proportions, testing different openness. I think we can pass them around a bit, the fabrics that we see here in front. Different, setups of openness, transparency, but also with them, it was a way of optimizing their machine for the wool yarn, which is not what they usually use. So I did a series of 6 different designs, and was really curious how they interact with each other in superposition with light and color contrast. I don't know what that is. And really seeing them as a new way of sheer fabrics we put in front of the window that sort of make a barrier between inside and out. With this, I'll go a bit quick. So there was also some research on color and actually how this natural wool can be dyed, keeping in mind that it's a écru color and not all colors can adapt the same way, because I didn't want to bleach the wool. So with textile color, we're currently running some lab dips. So these are some examples to see also how from a first structure you can go into more like a design and a product and invite color. And the second part is also seeing how they perform in the fire retardancy tests. So far, no good news, but many ways to improve that. And this is because this is a fabric that still has a blend with 15% nylon, because that's the available yarn. But this is something that I see, positive outcome if we can try some different wool compositions and maybe some FR treated wool to really push it. So 2.5 months go by really fast. Designing and developing products that are compatible with the market standards and economically realistic, that takes a lot of time. So this, for me, it was really a first step. And myself, I'm really motivated to continue with the embroidery development. I think it's, for me, a completely new technique, and it's interesting to see the possibilities of them. And that's it. 10-minute timer. It was a residency full of a period of creation, a lot of stimulating encounters with the whole TaDA partners, the team, and the other residents. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so we will engage in a short conversation. So in our previous conversation we had, you mentioned that you stopped working in fashion because it's too fast and you didn't see any possibility to make an impact. And so I was wondering also the client you work with in interior architecture, there's a timeline.
Exactly.
But
Yeah.
you told me that you have decided to dedicate some time to your personal research. So I was wondering what's the role of this time, and also maybe like this residency, what's the role for the future or for
Yeah.
your personal also
I think
development?
when it comes to design and time, like design, it starts with the concept, right? And then you start working with material. But even though many years of experience, you never know how material is going to react. There's always a surprise. And if you're on a really tight timeline, then comes the first consensus and you need to readapt and make some decisions maybe you would not if you would have more time. And that's why I think this residency, it's really interesting because there is time to explore, to start up an idea, to be really curious and allowing yourself to also fail and start again. And I think that's something in regular practice when you work for a client, that's not really an option.
Failing is part of the process.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So you mentioned also that acoustic textiles, I mean, in general, acoustic in architecture is regarded as secondary. And so maybe you can talk more about is your personal interest in this acoustic subject in general.
I don't know. I don't know if it's secondary. It's the word. Now I'm thinking about it because it's getting more and more important, right? That's
I
also
think
why we're
it
here
is, of
talking
course,
about it.
important. Yeah.
But it's maybe unexplored in a way. I don't know. Personally, I think we all know the experience of going through a restaurant that you're sitting half a meter from your conversation partner. You cannot hear them. Myself, I'm half deaf, so that's already a big handicap. And there's ways to improve that, but textile as a curtain, it's only one aspect. There's many more. There's many more other techniques we can use actually to improve the acoustic surrounding. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned also that I have to talk to the mic. That's also a health issue because I think we will deepen also this subject because it's kind of also almost an ethical issue. What I also found interesting is how you dive into this archive and into the history of the local traditions. Can you talk more about what were your learnings there? What fascinated you the most?
Well, I think I could spend a year just looking into that. On a because I'm not an expert like Luba, but on a very superficial level, I was really intrigued how in the Sangalen industry, all these manufacturers, they used already this historic lace textiles. They analyze it, they copy it, they reproduce it. And I think it's interesting how you have certain fabrics in a certain use. So it's a sheer fabric you put in the window with the floral decorative pattern, but the design and its fabrication goes through different techniques, but holds on to specific identity. And I think that's really interesting how design can transcend technique in that sense. Yeah.
And talking about the cultural context, you have worked in different fields, but also in different countries. I mean, you were Dutch and you work in France. You have worked for Quadrat in Denmark, and now you worked here in Switzerland. So, what if you compare from the mindsets? How would you describe, or what did you encounter as a specific local expertise?
Just kindness, kindness, and a lot of patience. But I think that's also really specific of the TaDA Residency program to work and exchange with people who are sincerely interested in looking at subjects from a different angle. Whereas when we're in industry, it's just a straight line. So I don't know if that's cultural or really specific to this program, but it was really enjoyable. Yeah.
And I mean, also in the Marianne mentioned also the theme of sustainability, and we know all that with the climate crisis, this will be more important than ever. Textile industry is not is quite harmful also. But how do you experience this the shift, or do you experience a shift in the mindset of your clients? And
maybe not the clients per se. Maybe the final client is interested, but it's still very much industry based on money and time. And that's why I think in this type of program, it's easy to push things that maybe don't seem obvious or possible at the first aspect, to really find a different angle and actually go into this research project to propose different things to clients that are already quite developed to convince, instead of staying around with hypothetical. Yeah. You need to get things done at somewhere to get started. Yeah.
So the solutions are here. It's more about the communication, how you put in,
or not solutions, but different approach, and just exploring. And at some point, you also need to find clients who are willing to take that experiment and to work together and challenge this industry standard. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Good,
for
thank
this
you.
insight.
Yes.